So hi, my name's Carly Kosturik. I'm a historian, and I focus on the history of video games. I work at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and that NSF logo you see up there is because the National Science Foundation actually funded my current project, which is looking at the history of the Games for Girls movement. So I've been working on this since about 2019. So the talk I'm going to give today kind of covers like a lot of things, and I'll try really hard to leave some room at the end for questions so I can talk about different things if you want to hear about different things. But this talk is called Women in Games, Games for Girls, and Video Gaming's Messy History. I'm so glad to be at MAGFest sharing this with you, so thank you. Thank you for showing up. So if you want to know a little bit about me, my first book is called Coin-Operated Americans. It's about the history of the video game arcade in the United States, and in particular kind of how video games came to be associated with boys during that period. My second book is a design biography of Brenda Laurel, who founded Purple Moon, which I'll be talking about a little bit. And then the third book I'm working on, it's actually hopefully finished, with my colleague Matthew Thomas Payne from Notre Dame, and it's a book about the Ultima franchise and its role in the development of the role-playing game genre. So those are kind of the things I have been working on, and this is what I'm working on now. So I like to always start with this picture. It's so cute, is part of why. And the person on the right is Joyce Weisbecker. This is from about 1978. She's a teenage girl. She's like 16 or 17 there. And her dad worked at RCA. And one of the projects, and he was very into building computers at home, and one of the projects he kind of was working on tangentially was RCA's own efforts to kind of enter the computer market. And he would bring home the systems and let his daughters play with them, and he taught them how to code. And they actually got really into making games. And so at some point, RCA started paying Joyce to make games. And she kept doing that through high school and then into her early 20s. So she's probably the first documented instance of a woman designing a computer game for a commercial market. And she also talks about being the first independent game designer because she actually only ever worked on contracts. So the games were kind of made for them as an external contractor. Like she wasn't like making them to specifications the company set. So that's a fun one, right? And then there's Carol Shaw, who is most strongly associated with River Raid. She started working at Atari a couple years before that, and then left Atari and went to Activision. While she was at Atari, she was often called like the best programmer Atari had, right? Like she was considered this like really, really, really sharp expert. And so she goes to Activision, she makes River Raid. Activision, early on, if you didn't know this, like starts partially because people want to get royalties for their games and get credit for their games. It's started by several people who defect from Atari. And so River Raid does really well, and so Carol Shaw does really well. So she actually retired in 1990 because she did really well in this. And I like talking about these folks because I want everyone to keep in mind, like, we talk about women being underrepresented in the game industry, but it's not because like there weren't women there before, right? And there's nothing necessarily natural about the history of anything, right? It's always like this complex interplay of like cultural and social and economic factors and individual decisions and policy and all kinds of things, right? So there's always been women making games. There's always been women playing games. And some of the women are really fun characters, right? So we also get probably, this is one of my personal favorites, is Lila Zenter, who worked at, does anybody know, has anybody heard of her before? She worked at Exidy, which is a company that was known for kind of making shocking games. They made Death Race, based on the movie Death Race 2000. It wasn't like licensed or anything, they just like took the premise and ran with it. And then they also made Chiller. Does anybody know Chiller? It is a game about torturing people with a light gun. It's super upsetting. Like, I don't know, it's not super high fidelity, and I've like played many things, and I love horror films, and that game makes my skin crawl. But anyway, so Lila Zenter worked at Exidy, and anytime the company was interviewed, it was usually actually her. It would either be her or Pete Kaufman, the man next to her in this photo, who was the founder of the company. She was VP of sales, and for several years was the highest ranked woman at any company in the United States, any game company in the United States, right? So really, really influential in how kind of public discourse about games is shaped. And you also get folks like, this is Millie McCarthy. who was she married into the business. She married someone that had a coin-op business, and he died, and she kept the business going. And so, and did quite well. She became president of the New York State Coin Machine Association. She was also the first woman to be head of the Music Operators of America, which is like a big deal. And was often like kind of advocating for games. This is a good business. This is a wholesome business. Of course we're worried about kids just like you are. Of course the games are good for kids, right? And I just want to mention, because I'm really proud of this, I wrote an article that talked a bit about her for the American Journal of Play, which is published by the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester. And after this was published, they were actually able to find her family. She's deceased, and they have her papers now in the archive. So like her story and her work is being preserved, and she's a super interesting person. And like something I didn't even know, because it wouldn't show up in the articles I had access to, is she actually had done tons of work about like women in business and kind of advocating for more equitable access, right, to employment and to professional opportunity. So like just a really interesting figure, and I love this photo of her. And then this is someone you may have heard of, and she's often really villainized, but it's Ronnie Lamb. So you may know Ronnie Lamb? So Ronnie Lamb at one point was called like the #1 enemy of the video game industry. She was a PTA president and a parent, and this is her on like nightly news on a big like news show, and she advocated for video game regulation in the 1980s, and she's often really villainized for that. But if you go in and look at what she's saying, it's because, for example, the corner store near her child's school was letting kids come in and play like during the school day when they were supposed to be in school, right? And like that's something where like maybe the person working should just send them back across the street, right? And kids were showing up with no lunch money at school, and it was causing problems because they're actually in an area that wasn't super high income, right? And kids need to eat. So she's often villainized, but she's also super, super savvy, right? And like there's interviews with her, and she flat says, she's like, yeah, I'm at these interviews, I'm going up against these like sleazy guys, and they look like they're going up against mom and apple pie, right? So she would like dress up real nice and go do this. Like she was very smart. And she's treated as this just kind of like reactionary, but I think that dismisses what she's actually doing and actually dismisses how smart she was, right? So there's always women shaping kind of how games are happening, and you probably know of any of these, if you know any of these. Roberta Williams, who co-founded Sierra Online, and who designed Mystery House, which is the first graphic adventure game, hugely influential, right, throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. But there's also lots of women that we don't know, right? The picture on the left here is the factory floor at Atari, and this is board assembly as it's happening, and as you might be able to tell, I know it's like a black and white photo that you're seeing from far away, but most of the people working are women. And in particular, Atari employed a lot of women who were Latina or who were Black, and they prioritized hiring women for assembly a lot of times because they had smaller hands, and the work was very delicate. So you have that kind of work, and many, many companies had a more diverse workforce in the factory than they did elsewhere, and those are jobs that are not well documented or not really well, like, we don't know a lot about what that was like, right? Similarly, the other picture is the entryway into one of Atari's offices. And so that's the first thing you would see coming in. And that's the woman answering the phone at the front desk, right? And again, like there's all these women working in administrative roles and marketing roles. The first marketing research done in video games was by women. Carol Cantor headed up a division doing that at Atari, right? So there's people doing things that matter a lot. They're just not always the people you know about. But something that did happen, and this happens deliberately and also accidentally, like the perfect combination, which is after there's a big crash in the arcade industry, right? And so in the mid-90s and then into in the mid-80s and then into the 1990s, companies really focus in on boys as their target market, right? And they start off as like 6 to 12. Our target market by the mid-80s is like boys 6 to 12. But then when those kids got older, rather than like expanding or like thinking differently, they're like, now our market is boys 12 to 18. And apparently in the 90s, the way you like marketed to boys 12 to 18 was just by being super gross. And so these are ads from the last time I was at the Strong Museum of Play in the archive. They have a fantastic archive. And these are all consumer magazines, like from the mid-90s. And this is one, it's for an ad for the Game Shark, and it's a family photo that's like askew in its frame, and there's like the little family letter that you would get like in your Christmas card. And the girl, who looks traumatized, has a bite out of her arm, but is still posed. And the parents are like oblivious, right? And they're like, hey, you know, and the boy has shark teeth and like has like written in red, like abuse the power, right? And the Game Shark, if you're not familiar, is a device that was like basically like ultra cheat code system, right? To like let you be better at games. So it's such there's so many things going on here. I could probably talk about this photo forever, but this moment of like, you know, the sister is kind of like a target and also like not worth worrying about, right? Like she's not the center of that story. And if you saw this and you're a girl, like it's pretty clear that's not for you, right? Like we all got that point. And then you get like this ad campaign. There's actually 3 or 4 different ads in this campaign. It's for Battlecruiser 3000. And it's the, not now, I've got malfunctioning weapons system, found 4 damaged, interception on the planet below, and radiation spreading through my battlecruiser. Oh no, right? And then at the bottom it says like, you know, Derek Smart's Battlecruiser 3000 AD, the last thing you'll ever desire. Which is, again, super gross, right? Because then like, is she a thing? Like, is that where we're going there? And then like, she's only worth bothering with because she's like a hot woman in a lingerie, and like, it's like so problematic, right? Like it's so fraught. And so, and again, like this feeds into other things that have gone on in the electronics industry and in the games industry for a long time. These aren't like one-offs, right? Like these are actually, there's like thousands of different ads. And so even like you get this one, and I've always found this one like actually a huge bummer. This is for Blockbuster. They're like summer game rental, like they would try to encourage people to rent games over the summer. And this one's all about like how it's better to be inside playing video games because outside there are mosquitoes and people burning hot dogs, and also your mother is wearing a swimsuit. How dare that woman enjoy herself? What a monster, right? And again, like these are things like I grew up seeing, and like I've had the body type I have now my entire life. So like imagine like you're a 16-year-old that loves video games and you pick up one of these magazines at the local Hastings and you're flipping through, right? It's not for you. You do not belong here. But at the same time that all this is going on, oh wait, there's one more. The Kleinfelder twins, is it the breasts or is it 2 girls he was dating? I do not know. Totally unclear, right? And again, like these are ads from major companies. These aren't like fringe weird things. It's just like normal advertising. Yes?
Isn't Klinefelter syndrome a genetic disorder in which males will have XXY chromosomes and breast growth?
Yes, but I also don't know if they just used the last name at random. I don't have enough context about how that ad was made, but that's, yeah. There's always like layers and layers to these, and there's definitely a lot of interesting, they're interesting, right? I actually give my students individual ads to like write about because they're a good way to learn analysis. So at the same time that's going on, there's actually a push starting in the industry because they're realizing that focusing on a tiny market, which is like boys from maybe 6 to 18 or 12 to 18 is like not a good way to make money actually, right? And so this is a woman who was hired by Sega. She had been working at Marvel prior to this, and they aggressively recruited her. They actually offered to pay for her wedding planner. Like they like come work for us. We'll pay for your wedding planner, which is like like what a weird thing to do, right? But like we're not gonna give you a hiring bonus, but we'll pay for your wedding planner. And so she was brought in, and part of why she was brought in is that she was someone who was very, very interested in kind of diversity and representation, and was starting to see how poor that was going across media, right? Not just games. And so she's brought in and she helps form a women's task force at Sega in 1994, and they collect tons of data about, you know, are girls playing? What would girls play? Do girls play? Do girls play differently? Are girls interested in games? Like all these kinds of questions that you might ask. And she talks about like the only way I was going to get them to pay attention was to turn it into money. And so I presented as like, you know, we're leaving this huge market on the table. And if we don't start creating content for girls, someone else is going to do it, right? And so they never really like actually did tons of console production there, but it did start kind of leaking into how they were talking about advertising. The game shown here, which is called Crystal's Ponytail, which is such a cute pun, so cute. Was one of only a handful of games that were released under the Sega Club label. The Sega Club branding was supposed to be games for children. And so in fact, when they were looking at doing games for girls, like they meant like girls, like small children, because then you have a market that you can actually train up into games, right? That like they're used to games, they like games, they accept games as part of their landscape. And so this is one of the only games that's released from that. If you're interested in this game, and actually several of the others I talk about, there's copies of them in the museum. So they're not all available to play, but you can at least look at the packaging, and there are some of the games available on computers as well. So if you want to look at Barbie Fashion Designer, for example, you can go do that. So Sega starts looking at these things, and simultaneously a bunch of other things are happening, right? Like this is a game made for the console, but there's also like CD-ROM is becoming a thing, right? And CD-ROM is actually a very interesting technology, and it enables a lot of changes in how we think about media. So one of the most successful CD-ROMs for 1995 is this. It's Chop Suey, and it's a little interactive adventure. It's pretty like unstructured, like you can just kind of explore and play and see what's there. It's a little girl and her friend, and they kind of like go around and see friends and family and go in all the shops and like kind of spend a day the way you might as a child if you lived in a small town and were allowed to wander, right? It uses this really deliberate kind of like playful folk art style. David Sedaris is the narrator. Brendan Canty from Fugazi wrote the music. And it's made by two women, Monica Gesu and Teresa Duncan, who worked at Magnet Interactive, which is actually local and is an advertising company, functionally, marketing and advertising. And they worked there and they pitched it. They're like, what if we made a game, right? And so they make this thing. They sell 80,000 copies, which is pretty good for an independently made game at that time, right? It's not made by like a game company. They don't have the existing shelf space agreements and things like that. And it wins tons of awards. Like it's a big deal. Entertainment Weekly names it CD-ROM of the year, right? Like it does really well. Teresa Duncan, who worked on this, also did two other games, Smarty and 00 shortly after that. But this game really is kind of this like weird breakout thing, right? Like it's like, wait a minute. And Duncan, when she was asked about kind of like her design ethos, she said, you know, my stated goal in life is to make the most beautiful thing a 7-year-old girl has ever seen. Or sorry, a 7-year-old period has ever seen, right? And so it's really about an aesthetic that appeals to children, that is welcoming to children. It's about building worlds that make sense to children and that feel like somewhere to play and explore and grow. And looks so different from almost everything else on the market, right? And very much looks different from what you would end up with if you were looking at console games at the same time. And so then this is 1994 as well. This is Mackenzie and Company. It was released by Her Interactive, which is a subsidiary at the time of American Laser Games in Albuquerque. And Sherry Grainer Ray was hired like halfway through this project. And I interviewed her and it was amazing. And she said like she was hired and she goes in and she's like, they're like, yeah, we just need someone to like finish up the game. And she's like, okay. Right? She'd been working at Origin. She knows how to make a game. She goes in and they hand her a box of tapes. She's like, what's this? It's the game. What platform are you developing it on? It's video. What do you mean? Right? And so she ends up they end up figuring out how to do this like basically in a video editing program. And so it was developed based on the VP of marketing at American Laser Games had a teenage daughter and was like, I bet her and her friends would like play a game if like it was anything they cared about. And so they went into the Albuquerque public schools, they got access and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of girls. They did this extremely robust market research. And this is the game that came out of that. It's called Mackenzie and Company, and they couldn't get made to publish it, right? Sherry Grainer Ray says, we took our work, demographics, prototype, and half-finished game out to the publishers. Every one of them responded with, girls don't play games, and shut the door in our face. So we self-published the title and sold 80,000 units. And again, at the time, 80,000 units is like pretty good. They actually did some really interesting things. Like they worked with stores that weren't software stores because they couldn't get any of the game or software stores or departments to really work with them. And so like, all right, that's a problem, right? maybe we can figure out where the shoppers we need access to are. Like, what department are they in? Where are they going? Like, how do we get access to them without having to get into the software department, right? And they actually were selling at Sam and Libby shoe stores. Sam and Libby shoes in like early to mid 90s were like extremely trendy, right? And so they were like point of sale. They would have like them set up at the register when you were going to check out. It'd be like, oh, here are your shoes, and would you like to buy this game? Right? And then they also got into makeup departments. And so you'd be purchasing makeup, and they'd be like, would you like to buy this game? Right? Like kind of the upsell at the end of your shopping. And they did pretty good, right? It also, in some instances, shipped with a lipstick in it. This game also shows an interesting thing, which is that part of the problem is it's not just games aren't being made for girls, it's also the infrastructure, right? Like there's not publishers at the time that want to publish games for girls. There aren't stores that want to sell them. There aren't distributors that want to distribute them. And so like, you're really kind of swimming against the creek. This game gets reviewed a little bit. And think about this. Who reviews video games in 1994? Men. How old are they? 40s? Yeah, that's probably fair. Who has more contempt for teenage girls than men in their 40s? Men in their 50s. It just increases on time, right? Like, and so you get these reviews that are just like raking this game over the coals for being like frivolous, right? That it's about shopping and talking to boys and running around with your friends and like all these things, right? And I'm not saying it's a perfect game or it's a great game, but I don't think men in their 40s were the audience. But the reviewers never took a moment to go, wait a minute, maybe this isn't even for me, right? They like reviewed it as to the same standard they would review anything else they were looking at, which is absurd, right? Like if I'm reviewing a book that's like a dense history of the Ottoman War or something, right? It's a very different book than I'm reading a young adult novel about like fairies on the moon. Those are not the same. I have different expectations for them. And games are like that too, right? Like you should have different expectations for different kinds of things. And so the game circulates, but it's often used as this kind of punchline, but it made money, right? And so it enabled them to do other projects. And so in the long run, Her Interactive does very well. And they spin off, and American Laser Games actually goes bankrupt, and Her Interactive is all that survives, right? It was better than the rest of the company. So this is just, you can see this focus group report again in the museum if you want to go look. I don't have a copy of Nancy Drew over there, which is sad, but anyway, so they're best known for this series, which is the Nancy Drew series, and got some fans? It's great. Love it. Which is one of the longest running series in like all of video games, right? Like there's so many of them. And so they start off with Nancy Drew Secrets Can Kill. They use this really cute tagline that I don't think you can actually read on here just because it's so small, but it's like Her Interactive for girls who aren't afraid of a mouse. And they do, again, massive amounts of market research. They have girls that are on their advisory board. Their playtesters are tween and teen girls, right? They're working really closely with the demographic that they badly want to reach. And so like you can read like in the kind of like, focus group report. And so this would be like, you know, a couple of focus group market research types sitting in a room with like probably like somewhere between 5 and 8 girls, right? Like just asking them questions and taking notes. And they're asking them like, oh, what kinds of games do you like? What do you play? What if this, right? And I look at the bottom, they always ask about Oregon Trail like that, because that was like such a huge hit. And they're like, likes the hunt. Likes to have clues in action, not just clues, right? But likes the hunt. And so there's these like really interesting observations. On one of the other ones, like there's something where they're like, you know, likes stories and also explosions. And they've like underlined explosions like 3 times. Right? It's like very important. And so often these reveal things that like maybe aren't quite what people were assuming about what girls would be interested in or what they would play. And so the Nancy Drew games do very, very well. So this is how Her Interactive is approaching it. And that research basis, again, is super strong, right? That's part of what Sega does, that like where they're getting information. It's definitely something Her Interactive is doing. And it's also something that Mattel does very well. Mattel's like actually famous for the kind of research they do. And just to clarify, Nancy Drew comes out in the late 90s. I'm just letting you know kind of like where her act went. But if you jump back to 1995, this is actually almost entirely responsible for opening that market up in some ways. So Barbie Fashion Designer is released in 1995. I'm bad at dates, it might be 96. I think it's 95. And it's released and it does extraordinarily well. They sell between 500 and 600,000 copies in the first year. And remember, a couple years earlier, I was like, 80,000, that's pretty good. Tenfold, more than tenfold that, right? And so it's designed for the home computer. I interviewed Jessica Durchen, who is the producer on this project at Mattel Media. And she was hired in after working on some other CD-ROM projects. And they really were thinking about how do you take what girls are already doing and then involve the computer in it, right? And so what you do with Barbie Fashion Designer is you use their kind of constrained system to design clothes, and then you can animate it. Like you can watch the little Barbie in the outfit you've designed walking on a runway, and you can print it. But you're not printing on paper, you're printing on fabric. You can cut it out, and you can color it, and you can tape it together. You can add sequins that come in the package with it, the sequins, and the little tulip tape paint that's like silver glitter. And it's just a smash hit. A fun detail from this is Jessica Durchen is producing, and they want to be able to print on fabric. They're like, it's gonna be so cool if they print on fabric. Like whatever about paper, right? Like that's not gonna impress anyone. Fabric. And so they're trying to figure this out. And so she's got all these different printers from all these different companies at her desk, and is constantly trying to run fabric through them. And like everything's like catching on fire and like smearing ink everywhere. She's like, there was a toxic cloud over my desk. Like people made jokes about it for months because we could not figure it out. And it was so frustrating. And so she's asleep one night and she has a dream that her bed's on fire. And she's like, wait a minute, sheets have a coating on them that's supposed to make them not be on fire, right? So she takes her pillowcase to the office and cuts it up and runs it through, and it goes through fine. And then she went over to the costume department because, as you may be aware, one of the biggest departments at Mattel is all the people designing outfits for Barbie, which is awesome. And the costume department goes, yeah, Trico. She's like, why didn't you tell me that? And they're like, no one asked us. So this thing that took her months to solve. But anyway, so you got some of the fabric that's like paperback that you can print on. Another interesting detail here, they deliberately waited to release this, and they worked on it at a pace because they knew girls didn't have access to newer computers. So they were waiting for this to be able to run on hand-me-down computers. So they needed the computers from a couple years ago to be good enough to run it. And so they released this. It does very, very, very well, right? And they make lots of sequels and spinoffs and all kinds of things. Some of them are good, some of them are not good, right? But it demonstrates that there is huge demand, right? This isn't, oh, no girls play games, you shouldn't sell them. It's like, if you try, they might buy it. One detail, though, they didn't plan to advertise this. Because why do you need to advertise Barbie? Everybody knows what Barbie is. So they weren't going to advertise it. They release it, nothing happens. And they're like, oh no, right? And so they go back and they make an ad. And we'll see how this goes. Okay, we're not going to get audio, which is fine. And so what the ad did, though, is it showed you how to play with it, right? So the girls are playing together. They're like negotiating what they want to do. It's showing all the different changes you can make. There she's on the runway, right? And then they're doing all the craft activities together. And again, they're reiterating over and over again, you can do this because of the CD-ROM, right? And it comes with all this stuff. So again, it looks more like a traditional kit or toy or something, right? It doesn't just look like something that's just like a CD-ROM in a box with nothing else. It looks more like what you already have. It's familiar, it makes sense. Oh, your daughter's really into crafts. What if she was really into crafts and also really into computers, right? And so that's kind of what they're encouraging, and it's really, really effective. In a couple years later, we start to get the games from Purple Moon. And Purple Moon is a startup. One of the founders is Brenda Laurel, who had previously been at like Atari and Activision and a bunch of other places. Her background's actually in theater, which I find super interesting. And she had started out doing interactive fairy tales for a company called Cybervision, right? And then moves through all these different roles. And she had been hired to do research at Interval, which was a research corporation started in part by David Little, and she started researching gender, like how do girls play, would girls play games, how do girls interact with technology, what do girls like, on and on and on, right? And then as they're getting the research together, she's like, I think this could be a company, right? She said they did $5 million worth of research. Just massive undertaking, right? And so they develop, and their first game out is Rocket's New School, which you see on the left. And that one is in the museum if you want to look at the box. And I also have these little, you can see through the window, there's like a little figure. And that's like a little adventure friend. That's a little doll. And there's some of those in there as well. And so again, like kind of thinking about how are girls playing, can we support how they're already playing? Oh, it comes with a doll, or it comes with a backpack, or it comes with, right? So it's integrated into how you're already playing, how you're already moving through your life. In Rocket's New School, you use this navigation that is called kind of like emotional navigation. So you go through and you get in these little scenes, and it'll be like, asking you which thing you want to do, but it's almost always based on a different emotional response. So it's like, oh, you just found out that so-and-so was talking about you in the bathroom. Are you angry or sad, or do you not care, right? And so kind of thinking about it, and it was really this idea of emotional rehearsal, right? Because when they talked to girls, they wanted like support for figuring out how to navigate kind of like their social lives with other girls. And when they talked about themselves and their social lives, they talked about themselves as older. So even though this game is for 8 to 11-ish, it was done about a story about middle schoolers. So the characters in the game are like 12, 13. They're just a little bit older, right? The Secret Path series, which is the other series they release, is based on folklore. And so you go through and you solve little puzzles, and then you get a folktale, and the folktale relates to the problem the girl was having, right? And so it's kind of like the way you would get like an aphorism or something to help you process something or help you figure out a way to respond to something. It's lovely. An interesting thing with Secret Paths, you start in this little like secret tree house and you pull out a drawer and pick out which story you want to do. It's like really sweet. And Laurel had thought, oh, we'll make a game about the forest. The girls will want to go into the forest and they'll like take care of animals and like hang out with their friends. It'll be great, right? Like this is what I'll have them do. But then when she was doing research, the girls were like, I don't want my friends with me. I want to go alone. And she's like, oh, okay. And she's like, and do you like to take care of animals? And they're like, I want the animals to take care of me. Right? Like if you were going to help them with their emotional things, they wanted to be taken care of. They didn't want it to go do that work for someone else, which I think is like super interesting as we're having like more and more conversations about kind of like emotional labor and how much like girls and women are expected to kind of like carry the feelings of people around them, right? And so this game came out and they do well, but this is like the end of the 90s, and you may have heard of the dot-com burst, right? So everyone's like lighting money on fire to build the internet, and then they realized like they were just lighting money on fire to build like weird things on the internet. And so tons of companies just lose investors, and it's not always necessarily reflective of anything about the quality of what that company was doing or the potential it had. So this company is acquired by Mattel, and Mattel releases like one more game and then shutters it. This is also the period during which Mattel acquired Pleasant Company. You may know what Pleasant Company was?
The American Girl Dolls?
Yep, American Girl Dolls, right? So that's when Mattel acquires that. They also buy out the Learning Company from the guy who's now on Shark Tank, right? And so Mattel buys a bunch of these companies. There's lots of like not very great games being released during this time too, right? So I talked about some that I think are really interesting and like they're really thoughtful. And then there's like tons of games that are just like, we saw that girls like pink things, so we made this thing. It's pink, right? Like, and so there's like this huge mix of quality and of response, right? And so in many ways, like when we talk about the Games for Girls movement, we're talking about a failure, right? Like, did this revolutionize things? Did all these companies last? No. Did they make some interesting games? Yes. Did some of the games make money? Also yes. Brenda Laurel, who is retired now, still gets emails from women who work in the industry today who say, I wanted to make computer games because I played Rocket's New School. I wanted to make computer games because I played Secret Paths over and over and over again until I had to get a new operating system and I couldn't play it anymore, right? Because they wanted to be able to revisit it the way you revisit books, right? How many people have reread a book or rewatched a movie because it's comforting, right? And this game had become one of those for people. And so like Purple Moon doesn't exist, but the impact of that is profound, right? So I always think that's important because I think, yes, we're talking about failure, and I think there are complex reasons for those failures. But I don't think it means that they didn't do good work in all cases, or that like all these are bad or something like that, right? Like that is not the right takeaway. And I also think part of why the industry looks different, because it does look different, right? Like the number of women in the industry now is about 25% of the workforce, which is not great, but it was 11% 10 years ago. So it's better, right? And so these things do have an impact, and they do kind of like send signals about who belongs. Interestingly, almost all of these are on CD-ROM. Part of why that happens is one of the things they found when Laurel was doing her research was that girls didn't have access to hardware. Because the family would buy one system, they'd be like, yay, we bought a Super Nintendo, yay, it's for all of you kids. The girls would not fight for access. Right? So whoever was kind of the dominant person in that pack of children would take over, and not in all cases, but in many cases that meant like an older brother kind of like owned the thing, right? And so then girls wouldn't have access at all, and they just like wouldn't play because it wasn't worth the fight, right? To do something they may or may not enjoy and that wasn't super welcoming to them in the first place and whatever, right? And so they went after CD-ROM because it's a different medium. The computer is treated very differently than consoles, and it wasn't necessarily being monopolized in the same way. Carolyn Cunningham, who's a researcher at Gonzaga, actually found the same thing a few years ago when she went and did research on whether teen girls were playing games or not. The main issue in why they did not play was access, that they just didn't have hardware access. They were interested in the games. They might play games on their phone or on like a mobile device that they have, but they weren't necessarily playing other kinds of games because they didn't have hardware that was their own. They had shared hardware and they didn't want to fight for access. So all of that's, interesting, maybe, hopefully. But why does it matter, right? Because like it's interesting, it's the 90s, it's not the 90s anymore. Our understanding of gender has gotten much more nuanced and complex. I think we're having much smarter conversations about gender identity that are much less binary based and are more reflective of the diversity of experiences people have as they move through the world. But why should we care about this? Like, why does it matter who's making games, and why does it matter who plays games? And I'm sure this audience like understands that video games are important, right? But sometimes they don't. Sometimes I talk to people who do not, right? And so, I think a lot of people in this room, like me, probably it's like, well, video games are important because I love playing them, and they like, I get all these ideas and I have all these experiences and I make friends and it's great, right? But I would argue they matter for a lot of other kind of big reasons too. And not that like if all video games did was they were fun, like if that was it 100%, they would still be important because that's important. Like joy is important, right? But it's bigger and more complicated than that, right? Like there's all these kinds of things that happen when you start pushing people out of culture, right? There's a book called From Barbie to Mortal Kombat that was released in 1998 that was, kind of looking at what was happening in gaming. And they found that video games were often kind of like training wheels into technology, that they made people comfortable with computers and they made people interested in computer science and programming and how computers work and how they're made, right? They can also be a way that people get into career pools, right? And this is kind of, there's been many lawsuits in the history of the US about golf clubs, like not the clubs you used to play with, like the club at which the place that is a club, right? And you're like, who cares about the golf club? So the golf clubs you'd have golf clubs that were only for men, right? And you have businessmen playing golf. And they're doing business on the golf course outside of hours. And you're a woman, and you work there, and you cannot go to the golf course, and so you're left out of all these critical discussions, and so you're left out of professional advancement, right? And this is like a widespread problem, and you can have that kind of thing start happening with other areas of culture too, right? Where it's like, oh, everyone at work talks about video games, but I feel super unwelcome in any of the spaces where they play video games, and so now I don't get to hang out with them, right? And now I'm missing out on opportunities at work because they all think I'm no fun. right? And like nobody ever says things that baldly. They're not like, we're not going to promote her. She's no fun. But people tend to like people that seem similar to them. And so if you're not able to participate in a way that makes you seem similar, you get left out, right? This is also a huge problem with hiring in the games industry. If you don't do active work to not be biased in your hiring, and like this is all of us, none of us is above this, you will hire the person that is most like you. Because you're like, you know who's great? That person that's just like me. I'm great, right? And so it does this thing where it creates these really homogenous cultures, and that's what, then you end up with like a bunch of games that look the same, which isn't very interesting, and you have a bunch of workforces that look the same, and then you all get sued by millions of dollars by the state of California, right? Which I don't think anybody wants, right? So you have all these different problems, right, that work out professionally. Something else interesting is that more diverse companies are actually more financially stable and they last longer. So even if you just want to make a greedy, selfish capitalist argument for this, you should diversify your workforce. More diverse companies are also more innovative, which I think makes practical sense when you think about it for a minute, where it's like, oh yeah, if everybody's not like the same, you probably get different ideas, right? You're not all going to look at the same problem the same way. You're going to think about different things as problems, and you're going to get different approaches. And then the other one, and I think for me, this is the one I actually care about the most, video games are a major cultural form, and when people are left out of video gaming, they're getting left out of culture, right? You're getting pushed to the margins of the things that make up people's daily lives. And like, that's awful, right? Like, it's not a way to build a society, it's not a way to build community, it's not a way to work together, right? And it can cause some real problems. So that's kind of my formal part, and then we will have about 20 minutes to chat. So thank you so much for listening to me. If you want to buy my books, that's awesome. You can also get them from the library. And thank you. I also just want to mention, I'm on Twitter. I'm fairly active there, and that's an easy place to get me. I'm also on TikTok, where I mostly post about video games as kind of like a historical thing. So those are easy places to find me. Again, I have that NSF logo. The NSF funded this project, and it was extremely exciting because often the kind of work I do takes years and years and years and is very slow. And now it still takes years and years, but it's because I'm getting to do more and I'm getting to be more thorough. I'm also getting to train other people in the research methods I use, which is fantastic. So I've been collecting interviews with some of the folks that worked at these companies, and those will be stored in the archive at the Strong, and will be able to help other researchers do projects as well. So yeah, Amy, have a question? Yeah.
Just I guess a question about even like your line of work.
Sure.
Do you work for the Illinois Institute of Technology? Like what kind of classes do you teach?
Yeah, so I do work for the Illinois Institute of Technology. It's a private engineering university in Chicago. I work in the humanities department. I teach history of video games, which is like probably the most obvious thing I could teach. But I also teach classes on like pop culture, I teach grad students on like research methods and professionalism. I also teach classes in game design and interactive storytelling. And this summer, I'm super excited. I'm getting to teach a class about experience design, but we're going to theme parks. So it's experience design focused on built environments. Yeah. Yes?
Did anything survive of the games for girls?
So Her Interactive technically still exists. Like they kind of like will slow down and speed up. I think they're kind of like on paper, but they did keep making Nancy Drew games at least until I think 2018. So like that went on for a long time. That was cool. Yeah, so regardless, like they're still circulating, which is great. Mattel actually still makes tons of Barbie games, and I'm not saying that dismissively. And one of my favorite anecdotes, I have no idea if it's true, and if it's not, don't you dare tell me because I need this to keep me warm at night, is that when people make games with horses in them, they will go play Barbie Horse Adventure. Because when they made Barbie Horse Adventure, they like knew, you know who really knows about horses? Little girls that like horses. And so they knew like the animation had to be very good. And so now like when you make horse games, they'll actually like go look at this old children's game about horses. I don't know if it's true. I hope it's true. Please be true. It's so good, right? Also, actually, a story about that. I interviewed a writer that consulted on that, and he said when he was like working at at the time, the Barbie brand was like very, very, very tightly controlled. Like they weren't doing all this fun stuff where Barbie like tells you how to live your life better. Like I really like Barbie's vlog. And so he's like, oh, like, you know, here's this part where like there's some debris on the road. And so Barbie goes off and moves it so her horse can go. And they go, Barbie doesn't do that. Like, so now I think of that whenever I don't want to do something. I'm like, Barbie doesn't do that. Like, yeah.
I have a question. If you could generally talk about like any trends you've seen that came out of that movement or popular mechanically in games.
Yeah, like I absolutely, so that question was about kind of like trends or popular mechanics from those games. The Purple Moon games I find feel a lot like a lot of mobile games, and not in a dismissive way, right? Like, but that kind of like, there's lots of branching paths narrative games, right? Like tons and tons of them are games where it's like, how will you respond to this thing that happened, right? And like, they weren't like the first people to do that, but the kind of emotional navigation that they did, I think is pretty forward looking. Something else they did that I think is very smart, and the Barbie game did this to some extent as well. They really figured out kind of like how to engage an audience across multiple platforms. So if you went on like the Purple Moon website, you could actually write letters to the Purple Moon characters. And they thought like no one would do this, and so the poor like administrative assistant was answering them to start with, because they're like, oh, whatever, it'll be like 10 a week or something. It'll be like a fun thing she can work on. She likes writing. And then they're all coming in and they're like, oh no. Like, and they had like, you could write articles for the newspaper on the website, like that was of the school that all the games were at, where the characters are from. And so like lots of little stuff like that. You could write little notes to other players. You could trade these little like virtual treasures, like lots of stuff like that. So they were definitely very, in some ways, like very sophisticated in kind of how they were thinking about how do you work with an audience and kind of like build in your brand into an audience's daily life. I also think like that level of market research is still not normal in games. Like we've all played a game where you're like, why did they think anyone would do that? Like, why would you do that? Right, and so like that level of market research I actually find like quite radical. And that's not, I mean, Purple Moon does an extreme amount of it, but you know, that's something Her Interactive relies on really heavily. It's something that Sega was looking at as well. So that's something that I think we're seeing a little more of, but I think we should see like a lot more of, because I actually think it's really powerful. Yes? So if you're really interested in this, actually the book I wrote about Brenda, here I can go back, you can look at them. Maybe we'll all get dizzy. Terrible ads. But the book I wrote about Brenda Laurel, that book in the middle, it's pretty widely distributed. You could definitely get it from like your library. Barnes & Noble had it for a while. I don't know if they still do. But that talks about how Purple Moon was built and how Laurel kind of came into that. She also did a lot of interesting early work with virtual reality. So if you're interested in virtual reality, she's like a really interesting figure. If you're in UX at all, she wrote a book called Computers as Theater. It is fantastic. I strongly, strongly recommend it. It's like this like kind of like early touchstone in user experience and user design. And it's beautiful, and it's about kind of like how unsatisfying a lot of interactions with technology are.
Could you repeat that title again?
Yeah, Computers as Theater. Yeah. And there's like an early edition. The newer edition's better, but it includes tons of anecdotes about her time at Purple Moon too. I'm working on a book about this, but it's an academic book, which does not mean don't read it because it's academic. It just means it will take a while. So the kind of historical research I do like takes a long time, for better or worse, right? But yeah, and I do try and publish things when I can, but yeah. Anybody else? We could all stare at each other for 12 minutes. Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of these games are like CD-ROM based. A lot of them have like online components. How do you guys think games are also like mostly online?
I haven't looked at either. They're mostly online. That comes a little later. There are some companies that are focused on online stuff, and I am going to look at those, but I haven't gotten there yet in my research. There's also like, I think it's called Girl Tech. There's tons of electronic toys from this period, which are really, really interesting and important. So things like electronic diaries and Tamagotchi and stuff like that, I think are also part of this story. And they're somewhere that we don't tend to capture because they get treated as like not games. Rachel Weil at the Femicom Museum has done a great job like documenting a bunch of those, and I really recommend their website like to look at a bunch of these different toys, like talking board games and like all these things, because often they're kind of like video game adjacent, right? And yeah. A fun thing about trying to play games from the 90s is that it's terrible to try and play games from the 90s because basically emulation for earlier games works really, really well, and you can like run them in DOSBox and stuff and it's fine. And then you get to the mid 90s and it's just like, oh no, right? And so I have like an old laptop that we put on Windows XP, which is the last operating system that could read most of them. And we were like, yay, it works, we got it, right? Like this like really terrible old laptop, but it's playing. And then we realized I needed QuickTime 2 because they all use QuickTime 2. I'm like, where does one get QuickTime 2 in the year of our Lord 2016? And luckily I tweeted about it because I was just like, this problem is ridiculous. And Jason Scott, who's at the Internet Archive, was like, I think we have it. And the reason that the Internet Archive had it is magazines used to send out CD-ROMs with like random stuff on them to be like, buy this stuff, right? And they would include the plugins so you could play the demos, and one of them had QuickTime 2 in it. So then I was able to play the games. So anyway, some of these games are in the museum and you can play them right now because Phil Salvador did a bunch of work to figure out how to get them to play. And so I would totally go check them out because it's not that often that you can actually access these. Anything else? Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any ideas of modern games or characters that have also influenced women to get into gaming in the same way as these games from the 90s and earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. Like and some of these are, I'm a historian, so you're always like, I'm like, let me tell you about more old stuff. But definitely like and Lane Nooney has written beautifully about this. A lot of the Sierra Online games, they actually would get like love letters from players that were mostly women. And then Jane Jensen, who Roberta Williams trained as a designer, worked there and actually went on and if you don't know the story, it's so fun. Her main gig now is writing gay erotica under a pen name. She's awesome. She's such a cool person. And there's a book in this series about Jane Jensen. I didn't write it. Anastasia Salter wrote it. That's about that. But Jensen has done like tons of interesting stuff with like mobile gaming, with hidden object games and things like that. And those are genres that are heavily played by women. And there's also just been some shifts, right? So like Laurel was at the first GDC. She's considered one of the co-founders of GDC. And like, I've seen the photo. It was 20 of them. And there's like 2 women, and I'm like, who's this other woman? She's like, oh, that's so-and-so's wife. We don't know why he brought her, which is funny. And that might not be true. She may have been joking. I don't remember. But the point is, like, it was, you know, like, that looks different even a few years down the road. I think all the toys, I think computers being integrated into the K through 12 curriculum actually has had a big impact. There's also lots and lots of organizations trying to do work to get more women in STEM. Part of why I'm interested in doing this research is I think sometimes we're doing all this work to get more women in STEM and we're not assessing it or looking at what works or like reflecting it all. So it's just like something companies will like dump a couple $1 million in to feel better about themselves, and then they're like not actually doing anything long term that's changing. And that's part of why I really try and stress this problem of the ecosystem. Because one thing I think that's different now that like is not obvious is the reviewership for games has gotten much more diverse, right? Like I can think of several women that work at major game outlets and non-binary authors that work at major game outlets. And so you're getting different perspectives in reviews. And so that actually kind of changes how games get talked about and things like that. It's also much easier to distribute games. There's better, at least in terms of digital distribution. That doesn't mean it's easy to get noticed or easy to get seen, but definitely we're seeing some real changes that I think are interesting. Anything else? No? Everyone's happy? Yeah, excellent. But yeah, thanks for coming. I'll cut you loose. You should go, drink extra water or something.